Every day, thousands of tourists take the elevator to the top of the Empire State Building, completely convinced they are standing inside a monument to American ambition. They step out onto the observation deck, look over the sprawling concrete grid of modern Manhattan, and snap their photos. They believe they are experiencing the pinnacle of 20th century progress, a steel and glass testament to human ingenuity reaching for the sky. They are wrong. This iconic building only exists because of a family feud so incredibly petty, so deeply poisoned by jealousy, that two billionaire cousins systematically destroyed their own palaces just to make each other miserable. The ground beneath the Empire State Building is not a foundation of pure progress. It is the graveyard of a monumentally toxic rivalry. To understand how a family could wipe its own legacy off the map out of sheer spite, we have to cut through the modern skyline and step back into the cinematic, sepia-toned world of the 1890s. Welcome to the Gilded Age. It is a time of unchecked, ruthless capitalism, a period where industrial titans are forging unprecedented empires out of steel, oil, and railroads. In New York City, wealth is not just accumulating, it is mutating into something almost grotesque in its scale. There are no income taxes. There are no antitrust regulations holding the elite accountable. The chasm between the working-class tenements of the Lower East Side where families pack into windowless rooms and the palatial estates of Midtown is so vast they might as well exist in entirely different dimensions. The glittering epicenter of this new aristocratic universe is Fifth Avenue. Today, we think of Fifth Avenue as a crowded corridor of high-end retail, a strip of luxury boutiques and glass storefronts where tourists buy overpriced handbags. But in the late 19th century, it was an impenetrable residential fortress. It was a parade of French chateaux, Italian Renaissance, palazzos, and looming Gothic men. To own a home on Fifth Avenue was to hold the ultimate golden ticket to American aristocracy. And right at the corner of 34th Street and Fifth Avenue, the Astor family ruled supreme. To grasp the terrifying scale of the Astor family's influence, you have to realize that they did not just live in Manhattan. They essentially owned it. Their patriarch, John Jacob Astor, had built the first great American monopoly in the brutal fur trade before pivoting his massive fortune into buying up the island block by block. By the 1890s, they were no longer just a wealthy family. They were an institution. They were American royalty in a country that had specifically fought a bloody revolution to get rid of kings and queens. The undisputed queen of this massive empire was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. She was a woman of terrifying poise, draped in diamonds, possessing an absolute, iron-fisted social authority. To the outside world, she did not even need a first name. She was simply Mrs. Astor. Working alongside the notorious socialite Ward McAllister, Caroline dictated the absolute boundaries of New York's high society. Together, they curated the infamous 400, a strict, unforgiving list of the only 400 people in the city deemed socially acceptable to interact with. If Caroline Astor did not invite you to her legendary annual ball, you simply did not exist. You could be a newly minted railroad tycoon with $100 million in the bank. But without her nod of approval, you were a ghost in the social stratosphere. Her seat of power was her magnificent brownstone mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue. It was an opulent fortress of heavy velvet, gold leaf, and imported crystal chandeliers. But her most prized possession, the absolute jewel of her estate, was her sprawling, sun-drenched garden. In a city where physical space was the ultimate premium, maintaining an expansive, perfectly manicured outdoor garden right on Fifth Avenue was a staggering, almost offensive flex of wealth. It was her sanctuary, the place where she hosted exclusive afternoon teas bathed in the golden, unobstructed light of the afternoon sun. Just next door, sharing an adjoining wall, lived her nephew, William Waldorf Astor. William was immensely wealthy, highly educated, and suffocatingly arrogant. When his father died in 1890, William officially became the head of the Astor family in terms of bloodline and financial control. In his mind, this transition of power meant that his own wife, Mimi, was now legally and rightfully the preeminent Mrs. Astor. But Caroline had absolutely no intention of stepping down. Why on earth should she? She had spent decades ruthlessly cultivating her throne. She was the matriarch. She was the one the press wrote breathless columns about. She was the one who could make or break a family's reputation with a single glance. When the New York post office received letters addressed simply to Mrs. Astor, New York, the postmaster delivered them directly to Caroline's door, completely bypassing William and his wife. For William, this was an unbearable, daily humiliation. William wanted deference. He demanded that Caroline bend the knee. The feud simmered, then boiled over. William formally demanded that Caroline relinquish the title. Caroline, possessing the icy indifference of an apex predator, completely ignored him. She continued to host her lavish parties, continued to tend to her beloved sunlit garden, and continued to treat William like a minor, irritating peasant who had wandered onto her estate. Driven to the brink of absolute madness by his aunt's quiet defiance, William made a decision that would alter the landscape of New York City forever. He decided to leave the United States entirely, packing up his massive fortune to move to England. Before setting sail for Europe, William ordered the complete and total demolition of his own Fifth Avenue mansion. He literally tore down the walls of his childhood home, ripping up the imported marble and shattering the stained glass. He left a gaping, ugly, dust-choked crater right next to his aunt's pristine palace. But an empty lot was not enough of a revenge for a man this bitter. As the dust settled over the ruble on Fifth Avenue, society watched in stunned silence, wondering what madness William Waldorf Astor would unleash next. How far would a billionaire go to destroy a woman's sanctuary? And what kind of monster was he about to build in the dark? When William Waldorf Astor sailed for England, he left behind a massive, gaping crater right next to his aunt's pristine palace. But he did not leave the plot empty. Instead, he left behind an architect, an army of laborers, and a blueprint designed for pure, unadulterated vengeance. To understand the sheer cruelty of William's next move, you have to understand what a hotel represented in the 1890s. Today, we think of luxury hotels as glamorous retreats, status symbols where celebrities sip martinis in penthouse suites. But in Gilded Age New York, hotels were largely viewed by the aristocratic elite as transient, noisy, and intrinsically vulgar. They were places for traveling salesmen, transient businessmen, and the newly rich who had not yet purchased a respectable home. Building a commercial hotel on Fifth Avenue, the most exclusive residential fortress in America, was an act of architectural terrorism. It was the 19th century equivalent of opening a massive, neon-lit nightclub directly next door to a quiet, cloistered monastery. It was designed to pollute the very air of exclusivity that Caroline Astor breathed. But William didn't just build a hotel. He built a monolith. He commissioned the prominent architect Henry Hardenberg to design a structure that would shatter the Manhattan skyline. Rising 13 stories into the air, the new building was named the Waldorf Hotel. By modern standards, 13 stories is a mid-rise condo you barely glance at while walking your dog. But in 1893, it was a towering, unfathomable skyscraper. And its height was not an accident. It was a weapon. William specifically engineered the massive structure with one geographic goal in mind: to cast a permanent, freezing, inescapable shadow directly over Caroline Astor's beloved sun garden. Have you ever hated a family member so much that you literally altered the rotation of the sun in their backyard? We see modern billionaires engage in petty turf wars, today buying up neighboring properties just to leave them empty, or launching rival social media apps purely out of spite. But there is a distinct, chilling permanence to building a 13-story wall of masonry just to block your aunt's sunlight. It was a multi-million-dollar monument to malice. For months, Caroline was subjected to the psychological torture of its construction. Imagine being the undisputed queen of high society, trying to host an elegant, exclusive afternoon tea for the 400, while right next door, hundreds of immigrant laborers are blasting bedrock with dynamite, shouting over the deafening roar of steam engines, and hammering steel rivets into the sky. The dust settled on her velvet curtains, the noise rattled her imported crystal, and then the construction finished. The Waldorf Hotel opened its doors in 1893, and the true horror of William's master plan was realized. The shadow fell. Caroline's sprawling, sun-drenched sanctuarida, very symbol of her immense wealth and spatial luxury, was plunged into eternal afternoon darkness. The prized flowers wilted in the sudden, artificial chill. The golden light that had bathed her legendary parties was completely choked out by a wall of brick and limestone. William had successfully reached across the Atlantic Ocean and stolen her sunshine. He had humiliated her in front of the entire city. New York society watched with bated breath, whispering behind their fans, waiting to see how the great matriarch would react to this devastating public defeat. But you do not back Caroline Schermerhorn Astor into a corner and expect her to surrender. She was an apex predator of the social jungle. She did not cry, and she certainly did not beg. Instead, she calculated. Caroline quickly realized that the era of the quiet, residential Fifth Avenue brownstone was over. William's hotel had irrevocably changed the neighborhood, inviting the chaotic, transient energy of the city right to her doorstep. So, she made a strategic retreat. She packed up her sprawling fortune, abandoned her dark, shadowed browns, and moved her entire court further uptown to an even grander, more palatial mansion on 65th Street. However, she still owned the plot of land next to the Waldorf. She could have sold it. She could have walked away and washed her hands of the whole toxic affair. But selling it would mean William had won. It would mean he had driven her out. Caroline decided that if her nephew wanted to play a game of commercial real estate warfare, she was going to annihilate him. In a move of unparalleled pettiness and strategic brilliance, she contacted Henry Hartenberg, the exact same architect who had designed William's hotel. She summoned him and issued a simple, devastating command: tear down my shadowed mansion and build another hotel on my land. But there were strict conditions. Her hotel had to be taller. It had to be grander. It had to be more opulent, more luxurious, and more awe-inspiring than William's. She named it when the Astoria was finally completed. It soared 17 stories into the Manhattan sky, deliberately dwarfing the Waldorf by 4 full floors.
It was a massive, architectural middle finger wrapped in gold leaf and marble. If William had built a fortress to block her light, Caroline had built a mountain to swallow his fortress whole. The Astoria completely overshadowed William's creation, plunging parts of his hotel into the very darkness he had weaponized against her. She poached his wealthy clientele. She outclassed his dining rooms. She had taken his weapon and forged a bigger, sharper blade. By the late 1890s, the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue was a battlefield of brick and steel. The two towering hotels stood side by side, locked in a bitter, stone embrace. They were physical manifestations of deep-seated family trauma. Billions of dollars set ablaze in an arms race of velvet, chandeliers, and ego. Yet, there was a glaring, unavoidable problem. The two most luxurious hotels in America were right next to each other, sharing an alleyway, sharing an architect, and bleeding each other dry in a war of attrition. They were locked in a stalemate of spite, both suffering under the weight of their own massive overhead costs. Something had to break. Two warring monoliths could not exist in such close proximity without cannibalizing each other. Would this toxic feud eventually drive both cousins to total financial ruin, or would a sudden, unexpected twist force these two bitter enemies to do the absolute unthinkable? The standoff at the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue was fundamentally unsustainable. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Waldorf and the Astoria stood side by side like two heavily armored knights, locked in a death grip, slowly bleeding each other dry. They were the two most opulent, technologically advanced, and absurdly expensive hotels on the face of the earth, and they were cannibalizing each other's profits. William Waldorf Astor and his aunt, Caroline, were finally faced with the cold, unforgiving mathematics of their own egos. Spite is a powerful motivator, but it is an incredibly expensive business model. It was clear that if they continued this war of attrition, they would both face staggering financial humiliation. And if there was one thing an Astor hated more than yielding to a relative, it was losing money behind closed doors. Surrounded by frantic family lawyers and brilliant hoteliers, most notably the legendary manager, George Bolter Bitter, grudging truce was struck. They agreed to merge the two mammoth properties into a single, massive complex. But do not mistake this for a heartwarming tale of family reconciliation. There were no apologies. There were no tearful hugs. This was a hostile corporate merger executed out of sheer, terrifying pragmatism. To physically connect the two hotels, the architect Henry Hardenberg designed a glittering 300-foot marble corridor. It was lined with amber, draped in velvet, and illuminated by dazzling electric chandeliers. Society quickly dubbed it Peacock Alley, because it became the ultimate runway for the ultra-rich to strut, preen, and display their diamonds. But the truest reflection of the Astor family's deeply poisoned dynamic was hidden right beneath the surface of this new alliance. William agreed to the merger on one strict, non-negotiable condition. He demanded that every single doorway, hallway, and structural connection between his Waldorf and his aunt's Astoria be designed, so that it could be completely bricked up and sealed shut within 24 hours. If Caroline ever crossed him again, if the feud ever reignited, he wanted the ability to instantaneously sever the hotels and build a literal wall between them overnight. They were united in name, but utterly terrified of each other in practice. The hyphen in the newly christened Waldorf-Astoria was not a bridge. It was a heavily guarded border crossing. Yet, in a twist of profound historical irony, this architectural Frankenstein's monster became an absolute sensation. The combined Waldorf-Astoria did not just succeed. It fundamentally invented modern luxury hospitality. It was the first hotel to offer room service, the first to have electricity on every floor, and the first to place a telephone in every single guest room. It was the birthplace of the velvet rope, the charity gala, and yes, the Waldorf salad. By accident, driven entirely by their obsessive need to outbuild each other on that specific plot of land, William and Caroline had created the center of the universe. Kings, presidents, foreign dignitaries, and Hollywood's first silent film stars all flocked to the Waldorf Astoria. It generated astronomical, unprecedented wealth. For a fleeting moment in history, it seemed as though their toxic rivalry had accidentally cemented their physical legacy for all of eternity. But what happens when your entire empire is built on a foundation of reactive spite? What happens when you design a building not for the future of a city, but purely to cast a shadow on your neighbor's garden? Time marches on, and time is the ultimate, undefeated enemy of ego. By the 1920s, the world had fundamentally transformed. The sepia-toned Gilded Age of heavy velvet and horse-drawn carriages had been violently swept away by World War I and replaced by the roaring, kinetic energy of the Jazz Age. The 400 were dead or irrelevant. A new generation of wealth was dancing to jazz, drinking bootleg gin, and driving automobiles. And the city of New York had physically outgrown the Astors. The aristocratic epicenter of Manhattan had migrated much further north, up towards Central Park. The once exclusive, residential sanctuary of 34th Street and 5th Avenue was now a bustling, noisy, commercial thoroughfare choked with traffic and retail storefronts. Suddenly, the original Waldorf Astoria was no longer a glittering palace, it was a dinosaur. Its heavy Victorian architecture felt oppressive. Its layout, cobbled together from two competing, spite-driven blueprints, was hilariously inefficient. Because the cousins had built these monoliths specifically to torture each other, on that exact corner, they were permanently anchored to a location that luxury had simply left behind. Today, as those thousands of tourists stand on the observation deck, feeling the wind whip across their faces, they are totally oblivious to the ghosts beneath their feet. We see this play out into conquer a battlefield that no longer mattered. In 1920, billionaires of Silicon Valley, 3 decades we watched the ultra-powerful wage the unimaginable stabbers. The Astors sold over space to a believing their wealth makes them immortal. The most famous, most luxurious hotel in the world closed its doors forever. The wrecking balls arrived. Imagine the sheer, poetic brutality of it. The imported Italian marble, the gilded ceilings, the crystal chandeliers of Peacock Alley, all of it was ruthlessly smashed to pieces. But the corner of 34th and 5th Avenue offers a different, chilling lesson. You can possess all the money in the world. You can bend the skyline to your will. You can even steal the sun. But if you build your empire out of spite, eventually the city will just build right over you. The towering 13-story wall that William had built to block Caroline's sun was pulverized. The 17-story peak that Caroline had built to dominate William was reduced to rubble. Air sprawling. Their obsessive need to hurt each other meant that their creations were entirely obsolete. Within a single generation, had originally their spite had effectively erased their physical legacy from the map. In 1931, the dust finally settled and a new structure pierced the clouds. Rising from the graveyard of the Astor family feud was the Empire State Building. It was a sleek, Art Deco masterpiece, a towering beacon of modern capitalism that had absolutely nothing to do with Caroline's tea parties or William's fragile ego. It was a building looking toward the future, built directly on top of the ashes of the past.